Something something gacha is gacha and involves gacha. Gotcha. Have you ever summoned for something and regret it before? I think everyone has at some point playing this game, but would you happen to remember why you summoned for that thing in the first place? Was it because the unit had some nice fodder, or they had a cool gimmick or niche that didn't really pan out in the end? Or did you just think that it was needed? Maybe it's not that you necessarily need all the things you're attempting to summon for, but it could make some things moving forward a lot easier, whether it's a brand new skill or unit. But do you ever stop to think about whether you really need it? It's always a difficult question to answer a lot of the time, as each new book introduces a lot of new and interesting units, skills, and mechanics that make it super tempting to pull, especially all throughout this year alone. But are any of these things actually must-pulls? And to what degree can you actually quantify something as a must-pull unit? I think it's always going to vary depending on the context of the situation, as all types of strategies and game modes need certain units and skills to function. You know, Arena, Summoner Duels, Aether Raids, etc, etc. Arena requires high scoring skills and BST, which a lot of it just boils down to newer units, but you could build a lot of these high scoring units for free in the Grail shop, and you don't necessarily need all the new high scoring skills. Even if they are good, just as long as they are able to score well enough, it's going to be perfectly fine. But you know, it does help if the score is actually functional at least. For Aether Raid's offense, you don't necessarily need to pull for any of the new Aether Raid's offense mythics, because the game just gives you 3 for Light and Astra season. Some of the newer ones would be a lot more helpful, of course, but you don't have to pull for them. Hell, you don't necessarily need to pull for any mythics period if trying to succeed in Aether Raids, even including the defense-based ones. Of course, it's very encouraged to grab some defense mythics, more so the modern ones, so that you could at least have a team of 7 units and get some stat swings, but you technically don't need any of them to win in an Aether Raids defense setting, even if it would make succeeding a fair bit easier. Summoner Duels, technically you don't need anything but 5 random units that you just get from naturally playing the game, since you could just auto for all the rewards, assuming that's what the goal is, and of course not taking any other of the 2 subsequent modes into account, like Summoner Duels R and S, but that might warrant its own discussion. Regardless, you don't technically need to summon for most things in the game, but that's under the assumption that you want each of these experiences to be dull and even frustrating at many points, which isn't really ideal either. This mindset really works best in a vacuum, since it's not often realistic that you end up skipping 99% of the new additions in the game just because there's always going to be something that comes up that you may be out of luck without otherwise. But that just begs the question of what makes something a must pull, and by must pull, I mean something you have to go out of your way to get no matter what. A lot of people's answers may just be getting the latest and greatest strong unit, and of course getting a lot of the newer and stronger units would ultimately make playing the game a hell of a lot easier. No one's gonna deny that much. However, I don't think being a good unit inherently makes you a must pull unit, and this could also apply to some of the best units in the game too. I think one of the peaks of this year was Dual Leon, which everybody knows about by this point, and despite arguably being the best unit in the game at his peak, I never would have really said he was a must-pull unit, nor was the counter Firm Canto Curb, especially that, because just by sheer existence of the skill was he no longer being brought around, that coupled with Breath of Life, so he's basically doing nothing at this point. Inversely, I think a unit that's extremely bad could be worth pulling for if they have specific inheritables, which funnily can also tie back to the idea of getting skills specifically for good units. Sometimes you'll need a counter to the broken unit before the broken unit itself, although Attuned Micaiah kind of falls into both categories, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Lucia was one of Book 7's boogeymen, and there were some ways of getting around her, but they were very few and far between. So the best and most consistent options came from skills such as magic and physical no follow-up when they released. But that's also under the assumption that you have to fight these types of units consistently. I mentioned Dual Leon earlier, as I tend to bring him up every 10 seconds in every single video that I ever release, but he was predominantly a threat in Summoner Duels. He had some mileage in Aether Raid's defense, and he could be brought as an Aether Raid's offense unit, but his main dominance came from Summoner Duels. The counter to him in Summoner Duels was basically non-existent for a good while, but you could use units like Bride Sharena, or have a frontline soaker like Legendary Male Lear, or even some hardy fighter armors to an extent to deal with it at times, whereas you didn't really need to prepare for him in an Aether Raid setting per se. If they were a cav line team that happened to have him on the team, then you could just Gale Force instead of enemy phasing, because Aether Raids gives you up to 5 teams to work with. I think the context of where a unit will show up and whether they can run specific skills isn't often as talked about as it could be, or really should be, because it does matter a fair bit, especially when concerning whether a unit can perform well in the mode they're built for. A unit could drop on the next banner that completely destroys Brave Felix, but if they were extremely impractical to use in an Aether Raid setting, then he'd still be just as common in Aether Raids. Or maybe that unit is specifically dedicated to messing up the latest and greatest meta threat, but if they fail into a lot of other units because of how tunnel vision they are, then is that something you'll end up seeing around that often? The context of new additions is definitely going to matter a lot in the end, and it's something I think more people should be taking into account. Regardless, you may just be able to get away with a fair bit of free stuff we get from time to time, including the Divine Codes that gives out a lot of good skills, and while this may be cheating somewhat, the fact that we get a free CYL unit each year means that you could still have access to the newer things without having to spend orbs on it, also not taking into account the Hero Rises units we get each year, or the random 5-stars that we could be free summoning from random banners from time to time, but that's not anything conclusive, as it is just the prospect of it existing that makes it worth mentioning in my eyes. Still, you have leeway, especially now more than ever, given how balls to the wall everything is currently, but that still doesn't really answer the question of what a must-pull unit is or what could be quantified as a must-pull. Are the must-pulls going to be the newer skills that allow units to function at a much higher level? Is it the newer units that allow you to trivialize a majority of the game for a month? How about units that allow specific strategies to work that otherwise couldn't really work without them? And to be frank, I think the definition is always going to change depending on who you ask, because everybody has different goals with the game, but if that was the point I was going to end it on, then I probably wouldn't have made the video to begin with, because I think there are actual must-pull units that people really should be going for. One, obviously, is just going to be something that everybody kind of expects, but there are different ways of quantifying a must-pull unit, and I have my own personalized answer for that. When I think of a must-pull unit, I think of a unit that I cannot live without, and that could be based on two things. One, if you don't have the unit and your opponent does, you are at a severe disadvantage. And two, no alternatives to that unit exist at the time. Usually, these units are something that you just cannot live without if you're attempting to perform in specific game modes, because what they enable, or even disable, is just that invaluable. This is also somewhat of a concept that's only grown over time, since the need for specific units back even around the first 3 years of FEH was not as compelling, since many of the counters to some of the best units could be made through a budget level, through all the demote skills and units that we had access to. Attempting to counter something like Emblem Ike on a budget comparatively just isn't going to work in the same way. And I think Book 8 has had the most amount of must-pulls since Book 5, which is partially due to the pace of power creep. For example, there is no alternative to somebody like Attuned Micaiah, who can not only cleanse penalties, but inflict them herself, have incredibly amazing combat capabilities, and provide immense levels of support that rival even some of the strongest supports in the game. And for all intents and purposes, I'm perfectly fine calling her the best unit in the game currently. I have no qualm saying that whatsoever. The current state with her is that you need an Attuned Micaiah to counter an Attuned Micaiah, and that's how much she warps the game. That's a bit much, don't you think? She is very much a unit I would consider a must-pull, because one copy of her is game-changing in basically every facet of FEH. Even through a foddering perspective, because you can keep her even if you fodder her due to the attuned status that she has. Emblems, we were going to go to emblems, this was an inevitability, are also a brand new concept from the beginning of this year that are about as must-pulls as possible a lot of the time. You don't necessarily need all the effects, but the difference between missing out on somebody like Ike's emblem effect and Celica's emblem effect is fairly drastic. And this is a point even more in favor of emblem effects just being that worthwhile. All of these emblem heroes can fall off one day. Well, I mean, Marth never really fell off because he wasn't that good to begin with, and Celica just fell off because of Shield Fighter, but every subsequent emblem could fall off one day, and you could still be at a massive disadvantage if you didn't pull for many of these because of their emblem effects, especially since we lack alternatives. Although I dread to imagine an alternative to Celica's 5-space warping, which is kind of ridiculous on its own, but you get the idea. These units are just always going to maintain value and will always be good in every facet of the mode, and there's a pretty good chance you'll be at a significant disadvantage if you lack these effects and the opponent just happens to have them, because again, we don't have alternatives. And while I said this was definitely something we've been seeing a lot of in Book 8, you can definitely go back to prior books with stuff like Legendary Male Robin or Freyr, or Dual Chrom, to name a few, or inheritables that get through so many units and gimmicks like Hardy Fighter, or Saves, or Cancer Control, or Shield Fighter, a lot of armor skills, because the armor skills are kind of broken, but you get the point. This is how I would quantify a must-pull unit, and you'll most likely see a fair bit of people echoing the same sentiments when they do get revealed themselves. That being said, many of these statements are made at the time of these units' releases, so would they still hold up by the time they rerun? If newer units and skills keep going in and out at a faster pace than basically ever before, that also makes the prospect of investing in many of these units or attempting to go for them a lot more iffy, especially if you miss them on their debut, which is definitely a lot more fear missing out than anything else. But given the current pace of power creep and everything else going around, it's not exactly out of the question. I'm pretty sure by the time Dual Leon reran, yep, I gotta bring him up again, I got it, that's just how it works. By the time he reran again, they just completely curb stomped him with Breath of Life, or Firm Canto Curb if I remember correctly. One of those skills, but it basically nerfed him to a pretty significant degree. And that's the thing, they could just kneecap any of these units hard one day if IS decides it was enough time, but that could just also cause its own problems depending on how they approach it, and knowing IS, usually what they leave in its wake is not exactly any better, if not worse. But despite all this, there will always be things worth going for in the end, even if it's just to beef up your own favorite units or make performing in a specific role or niche a lot more functional. I do think that in most cases, however, there are going to be units that you can properly invest into given whatever amount of time it has passed, and they should still be worthwhile investments, and that really just boils down to the emblems, but that's just because you could give out their effects to pretty much anybody. So inherently, you're getting the most bang for your buck in terms of orb investment, but they're also going to age the best since those effects are just so splashable at the end. You know, unless they decide one day to go out of their way to counter specific emblem effects, or drop units that disable emblem ring effects entirely, like a Mythic Sombron or something. Then maybe they'll lose value, but even then it's so hard to say whether that could happen because giving any unit a free additional effect or two with essentially no cost is really valuable. And there will always be other units that come out that are so amazingly strong that they could be a worthwhile pull, but it's not as easy to jot down as an emblem hero. And maybe for any other type of hero, it may end up being a bit too late when you realize that these units are just that worthwhile to go for. Although I guess it depends on how much you play the game, because a lot of the time you could kind of look at somebody like this and be like, yeah, that's definitely somebody you have to get because it's kind of ridiculous. But, you know, emblems are always going to be a safe bet. And given the current pace of their releases, I'm most likely guaranteed to spend orbs every 3 months or so trying to get the newest one. Also, gacha.